Today's story is based on true events. I was able to talk to the person who gave her testimony of what happened to try and validate the several events that took place in her life. And needless to say, her story is quite shocking. This is Katie's truly terrifying encounter of what she believes was a witch. Hi, this is Zach and welcome to Rooted Expeditions. If you're a fan of the abandoned, historical, and strange events, then you are in the right place. Hit that thumbs up and let's dive right into this story. I guess I don't know where to start. The beginning would be the obvious place, but I don't know what the beginning was. The whispers, the shadows, objects moving by themselves, electronics going haywire, or was it the first time I actually saw it? The soulless pits for eyes and the featureless paper white face. I'm sure jumping right into "there's a monster in my closet" would be a bit cliché. I knew it was always there, even before it showed itself to me. The first time I knew, really knew, was Christmas Eve of 2010. I was with my ex-boyfriend at the time, and he had taken me home early from dinner at a friend's house because I was feeling ill. Naturally, I went straight to bed and he stayed up, decided to play his video games. I don't remember when I fell asleep or how long I had been out before I woke up. All I remember is how I woke up. My memory of waking up was crystal clear. Even to this day, I remember. While regaining consciousness, I remember an unnatural cold in the room. Yes, I realize it was December, but Arizona never gets that cold. I remember feeling freezing cold hands brush against my bare arms before the covers of my bed was pulled over my body. I hadn't opened my eyes until then, and I thought I saw my ex-boyfriend standing at the edge of my bed. My vision was still blurry, so I called out his name with a yawn and blinking to clear my eyes of this sleep. In a fraction of a second, the shadow I thought I saw was gone. I was ready to forget the whole thing and go back to sleep, so I just turned over to my side and now facing the opposite side of my room. If I had just closed my eyes, I would have not noticed the face sharing my pillow. It was so close to me, the pale white and almost glowing face with empty cold black sockets for eyes, that my nose almost touched it, and with an immediate jerk back, I nearly flung myself over the side of my bed, and I would have screamed if my dinner hadn't beaten my voice out of my mouth. Regardless, my ex had burst into my room moments later to witness me vomiting all over myself in my bed. Needless to say, he was pretty mad at me since he was staying over for the holidays at my mom's house and he had to sleep in the same bed with me. I didn't know how to explain what just happened or what I even saw, so I just stayed quiet. There was no further trace of this horrible face in my room that night, and I didn't see anything for a while after that either. Not even the shadows or subtle movements in the corner of my eyes. It must have been spring that next time it appeared. It was after high school one day, and my ex and I were arguing about what I can't remember, but the only reason I do remember the fight was because it was the first time he had ever hit me. It's funny that I don't remember the exact context, but I do remember locking myself in the bathroom and crying in the dark. I also remember a sharp, distinct tapping sound on the bathroom door. Thinking it was my boyfriend trying to apologize, I yelled for him just to go away. I didn't get an answer, but just more tapping, like a sharp fingernail on the thin wood of my bathroom door. But I could see under the closed door the shadow of someone standing on the other side, breaking the only light that was flowing into the bathroom. I called his name, no longer angry, no longer crying. Now I felt wrong, almost sick and nervous. When the tapping sound stopped, I stared at the shadow underneath the door, watching it stay still, feeling anxious now, and I slowly laid myself on the floor. I moved to look underneath the door, expecting to see the toes of my boyfriend's boots. Instead, I was met with a large and possibly deep eye socket and smooth, white, and featureless face. The same face that I saw back in my room during last Christmas Eve. This thing was just staring at me with these phantom eyes. This time, I was able to scream, and I screamed as loud as I could, screaming my ex-boyfriend's name at the top of my lungs. Then, the bathroom instantly began to shake with loud bangs instead of the quiet tapping, and I was afraid that the door was going to bust off its hinges, so I wedged myself between the bathroom sink and the toilet with my hands over my ears and my eyes shut tightly. It felt like an eternity before my ex-boyfriend finally came in to get me. This time, I couldn't hide what was happening. How do you explain screaming at the top of your lungs for no reason? So I told him. I even told him about the Christmas Eve event. I was surprised when he believed me, no questions asked, and even more shocked when he seemed to recognize my description of that awful, hideous face. His younger sister, who was my age, would apparently wake up to a white face floating under her covers, wearing her bed sheets like a cloak. He also told me their late mother was gifted, as he called it, and it was passed on to them. He believed it may have followed him to my house. So, yep, I had my ex to thank for that thing. And then he gave me what I thought was some pretty psycho advice at the time, which was just talk to it. He wanted me to talk to this thing, that horrible face. It was almost a week before I saw it again. It was a school night and I had gotten home late from my job that I had at a restaurant. All I wanted to do was kick off my shoes and fall asleep. The second I lay down on my bed, my eyes were drawn to it like magnets. It was hovering in the top corner of my closet, which was open, the face nearly glowing to distinguish itself from the dark in my room. I was frozen in fear, clutching the covers over my bed tightly to my chest as my wide eyes stared straight into its cavernous pits of this horrible face. I didn't know what to do. There was no way I was going to try to talk to this thing. So all I could do was stare back, frightened and half hiding underneath the covers of my bed. After what I felt like was an eternity and a half, the white face faded as it sunk back into my closet and I was no longer able to see it again. The next day at school was one of the worst I have ever had. I felt even worse than I looked, and I looked pretty dead. I couldn't focus in my classes, and I felt amazed by the time my last class ended that I made it through the entire day. I remember that second I was out of my classroom, my phone was up to my ear calling my ex-boyfriend. I had wanted him to come pick me up so I didn't have to walk home alone and go back to that house. I didn't want to go back to my house alone. However, he was out getting high with his friends, who disliked me for being a prude, as they would call it, and they convinced him not to come get me. I tried convincing him in my favor, but he still refused. Even after I told him about what happened last night, he just told me the same thing he did before and said, talk to it and ask it what it wants. He told me to have a dang conversation with this thing in my closet. That was the advice I had, however, and I didn't think to ask or trust telling anybody else. Asking for help was kind of out of the question for me. That night when I finally mustered up the courage to go to bed, I was relieved to apparently be alone in my room. I couldn't even bring myself to close my closet door either. I'm not sure if I actually fell asleep or if I just blinked. All I did was keep my eyes fixed on that closet the entire night, expecting this thing to return. With that brief closing of my eyes, it appeared. In an instant, I was wide awake and very frightened. With our staring match off, my eyes getting lost in its soulless pits, and I did the only thing I knew to do. I covered the blankets over my face halfway, and with a squeaky voice I said, "Hi." For the next few terrifying moments, I was afraid that that face would respond to me. The response thankfully never came, and the room stayed silent except for the sounds of my own breath. The questions I had for it came out a bit louder. "What do you want?" Never got an answer. The face would never stay long, and it would do nothing but just stare at me. I don't want to say that I actually got used to seeing the face, but eventually it stopped startling me. It even got to the point of me telling it goodnight before I turned my back to the closet so I could fall asleep. Back then, it never appeared outside of the closet. It would only show up at night while I was falling asleep. To this day, I'm not sure if the horrible face even had a body, but it did have to have hands in the least, and I say this because of what it would do to my ex. The first time anyone besides myself had noticed it was when my ex had spent the night with me. As usual, it appeared in my closet as we were falling asleep, and he noticed it first, and naturally he reacted as I would have expected. He sat up really quick, grabbing a hold of me, asking what the heck was in my closet. He eventually remembered about the face when I told him, and then I told him just to turn over and just ignore it, as I had been doing this for the past couple of months. I remember him telling me, "No, you need to tell it to leave." I stared back at him in the dark of my room, feeling surprised at him and his words. This face never did anything other than just stare. Rather than argue, however, I turned back to the closet and it was already gone before I could ask it to leave us alone. I pointed the fact out, actually sounding angry, as it probably scared this thing off. I left it at that and turned over, burying myself into my pillows and feeling ready to pass out. My ex, however, got out of bed and slammed my closet door shut. I wish he hadn't. I really wish he hadn't done that. A few hours later, at a time that belonged neither to night or dawn, I heard a voice. It was barely a whisper, but it opened my eyes nonetheless. I stayed still, just listening before I heard it again. It was louder this time, and it made my flesh erupt in goosebumps. It was my voice. It was my voice I was hearing, and it was saying one thing, my ex-boyfriend's name. I even heard him mumble next to me in response. That was right before my closet door exploded open, and we both sat up in shock. As soon as I turned to see the closet door wide open, I lit the room with my bedside lamp, and at this point my ex-boyfriend was cursing loudly, and I saw him holding his right cheek. On his cheek was a red mark that almost looked like he had been slapped. This is when everything started to go downhill. Whenever my ex came over to sleep, he insisted that my closet door be shut, and he even suggested replacing it with a lock. It wasn't every night he stayed over that something would happen, but we rarely had a peaceful night together. I say nothing bad has ever happened to me. It always was directed towards him, and in all honesty, the worse our relationship got and the more abusive he was, the more things that would happen to him, and the worse it got for him. That last time he had stayed over before I called it quits on a relationship, he was actually being choked in his sleep. I woke up to him wheezing and coughing, and his eyes were wide, and it looked like they were popping out of his skull, and his face was nearly purple with veins popping out from his forehead, and his nose had began to bleed, and I never saw anything attacking him, just the aftermath. I didn't keep in contact with him after the breakup to know for sure of what happened with him. However, I didn't see the face again after that night, or at least for a while. Nothing happened, not so much as a shadow or even a whisper. I had figured that the face had left with him and was gone for good. This is where I wish the story had ended for me. A couple of months later, my older brother and his wife had fallen on some financial tough times. Since it was just myself and my mom in the 5-bedroom house that we had, she invited them and their 2 children to come live with us. The quiet house was suddenly crowded and packed full of moving boxes and furniture, and not to mention the wild 6 and 4-year-old. By this point in time, I had graduated high school, and I was balancing babysitting my niece and nephew while my brother, his wife, and my mom were all away at work. Everything was normal, at least as much as it could be. Honestly, I didn't start paying attention to my brother and his wife's growing concerns over my 4-year-old niece's nightmares until I witnessed it myself. I originally figured that it was normal for children to have nightmares, because I still remember tons of twisted, demented, and frankly strange dreams from my own childhood. Eventually, I noticed my niece's lack of energy, and she just seemed to have little interest in toys, and sometimes I could encourage her to take a nap on the couch with me while I had my nephew watch TV. Other than that, I assumed that she had stopped sleeping at night because of these nightmares. The nightmares my niece was having only worsened when her mom got a night job, and when my brother was away for a few weeks training for a promotion at his job. My mom wouldn't get home until around 11 at night, so it was up to me to feed the kids dinner, bathe them, and put them to sleep. My nephew, even though he was only 6 at the time, liked to boast that he was too old for bedtime stories. I only figured that he said this so he could play his DS for an extra 15 minutes before going to bed. So it was usually just me reading to my niece in her room. On this one night in particular, she asked me to tell her a story instead of picking out a book to read. Not thinking twice about her request, I asked, "What kind of story do you want me to tell?" She answered me,
"Tell me about the witch."
I immediately thought of a story like The Wizard of Oz or Hansel and Gretel, and I didn't even get a sentence into the story before she stopped me, and she said,
"That's not scary enough. Tell me the scary story about the witch."
With her statement, I started to realize that she wasn't only asking for a scary story, but a specific scary story about some specific witch. "I don't know what witch you're talking about, sweetie," I admitted, feeling this dread slowly rising and filling up my body. In the back of my mind, I knew what she was talking about, but my rationality was quickly denying it.
"No, the witch that lives in your closet. Tell me the story where we die."
I was floored. I sat there staring back at my 4-year-old niece and her words running circles around my head, and I tried to process how I even felt about this. I was scared, I was shocked, I was baffled, I was even angry. It left me speechless with my eyes wide and my mouth agape. The face had never hurt me, but I had seen what it had done to my ex, and I wholeheartedly believed that it could kill. I wasn't sure what else to do, so I calmly told her to go to sleep, and I left. When my mom got home later that night, I was already waiting for her. I kept my composure and greeted her, even though I wanted to cry and tell her what my niece had told me. Instead, I held back and I asked her what the contents of my niece's nightmares were. She initially told me that she had no idea and that she was going through a phase. She seemed more agitated the more I pressured her about it. So after hearing what my mom had to say, I just flat out said, "She thinks we're going to die. She told me someone was living in my closet." My mom was careful with how she replied, and I now know that she was hiding something from me. She was having dreams about a person going into her bedroom at night, and that's it. It sounded like my mom was already over the issue, like my niece was fine now. With her words, I decided to finally quit pressing her about the issue. Honestly, I was afraid to go to sleep that night. I knew I would see that face. I just knew I would see it again. I also knew what used to happen to my ex when he would close that closet door. I was finally in my bed around 2 in the morning, but I couldn't muster up the courage to close my dang closet door. While I was falling asleep, I couldn't keep my eyes off my closet. I know I was dozing in and out of consciousness. My eyes would droop or close and then snap open once I realized what was happening. In what seemed like an instant, the face was there, staring at me silently as it has always done before. I was fully awake in a second and I stared back at it, too afraid to even blink. My fear slowly melted away into the anger I had felt previously, and I sat up in my bed, tightly gripping my sheets. Go away. I spoke to my room, but I hated how shattered my voice sounded. I took in another breath and more sternly I said, "Go away." The face didn't move from where it was hovering at the top of my closet. "Go away," I kept repeating until I was nearly yelling. The face was suddenly gone, and it took me a few more go-aways for me to even realize that. I sat in my bed, now silent, still staring at my closet door before I finally turned on the light. I felt fear filling me up once more, so before I was too scared to do anything, I finally bolted over my bed, jumping off the bedpost and quickly slamming my closet door shut. And as soon as I did, I stayed still for a second, with my heart pounding, half expecting the door to fling back open. I then took my dresser that was beside my closet and I pushed it in front of the door. My dresser stayed that way in front of my closet for the next few days. My peace of mind slowly began to return and my niece hadn't had any further nightmares. I had managed to get into bed early this night and my mom wouldn't be home for the next couple of hours from work. Of course, the peace didn't last long, and just before I was able to doze off, I heard what sounded like a quiet but sharp tapping sound. I almost ignored it, but the sound was persistent and growing louder and louder. I sat up in my bed and I just knew it was coming from my closet. I heard that same tapping sounds only months before. I sat in the dark room with my eyes wide open, staring at that closet door with my heart pounding in my chest. I was almost certain that the door would bust open at any second, despite my heavy dresser keeping it sealed shut. I sat there what felt like an eternity as this tapping sound got louder and louder to where it became a piercing noise. Then it suddenly stopped. I continued listening, eyes still wide and never leaving the closet door, trying to listen for any sound. I continued listening, eyes still wide and never leaving the closet door, while slowly reaching my hand out to turn on the lamp by my bed. My room now lit, it was still silent and my fear was slowly starting to subside before I heard another sound that came somewhere in the house. It was the sound of a door opening. I looked away from my closet and over to my closed bedroom door, still listening. Within seconds, I heard another door open. That's when I forced myself out of bed and I opened my bedroom door to look down the dark hallway. Then, I noticed that my niece's bedroom door was wide open. Taking in a deep breath, I walked forward and switched on her bedroom light. I somehow knew that she wasn't in the room before I was able to visually confirm the thought. When I saw her empty bed, I called out her name. I was only answered by my nephew's bedroom door slamming shut. Dread was filling me up and I wanted to run back into my room and hide under the covers of my bed, but I just couldn't. I had to be stronger than that. I slowly crept down the hall calling out for my niece and nephew, and still no one answered. As soon as I got to my nephew's bedroom door, I could see the light flooding through the cracks around his door. But when I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. It wasn't locked, it felt like it was jammed. It was like someone was holding the door closed from the other side. Banging on the bedroom door, I surprised myself with how loudly I shouted for each of the children by their full names. They still didn't answer me. But when I pressed my ears to the door, I could hear their voices and I heard a third voice, a young woman's voice. It was too muffled to make out what anyone was saying, but my mind started to worry as I completely freaked out. It was such a blur that I can't even describe how hard I was trying to get inside that room. With the state of mind that I was in, I finally got the idea to take the doorknob off the door altogether. The handle itself didn't have any sort of lock, and there were screws on my side that I was able to undo after running to the backyard to find a toolbox. After forcing the doorknob apart, I was able to see partially into the room. I heard my niece speaking softly, and I was able to see my nephew standing in the corner of his room in his pajamas, looking tired and confused. Finally, I was able to get his attention, while trying my hardest to not scream at him. He looked hesitant at first before scurrying over to help me unjam this door. I could still hear my niece talking to the third voice, and a realization hit me like a train when I heard it speaking back to her. It was my own voice talking to her, encouraging her to do something. My voice was telling her that she had no other choice and that her brother needed to die. I was still frantic, slamming into the door, trying to bust the door down to get inside that room. It felt like I was trying to move a solid wall, but eventually the hinges gave way and the door frame cracked open just enough for me to get inside the room. I grabbed onto my nephew as I was finally able to see my niece in the room. She was clutching the handle of a fillet knife my mom kept in the kitchen with both of her hands. All the knives were kept in a cabinet over the kitchen sink since the kids had moved in, and I still have no idea how she had gotten it. I was going to ask her, but the sight of the third person in the room almost immediately held all of my attention. In an image that my ex-boyfriend had described to me once before, I saw that white face in my nephew's room. The blankets of his bed were wrapped tightly around this plain face, its eyes impossibly black and empty. It was positioned high near the ceiling of his room, just hovering over the bed with nothing but air between the mattress and the ends of the blanket. I had never experienced a terror so great before in my life, and I'm surprised that I didn't even begin to scream. I could still hear my own voice pouring out from this face, encouraging my niece to kill her brother and now myself. I was able to tear my eyes away from this soulless gaze of this white face so I could look back to my niece. She was slowly coming towards myself and my nephew with a large knife in her small hands. I was able to bring myself to action once again, and I reached out for her, spinning my niece around so she was facing away from me. And I picked her up around the waist and she dropped the knife and we were able to flee the room. I grabbed onto my nephew's arm so hard that I ended up bruising it as I pulled him after me. I only stopped to grab my purse before running with both of the kids out of the house. I shoved both of the children into the back seat of my car before backing out of the driveway and speeding away from the house. At this point in time, my niece was screaming and my nephew was crying and angry, and I remember the 6-year-old yelling at me that he didn't have his car seat or even his shoes. I was still in full panic mode, crying and hyperventilating, and I had no idea what to do. I would have been driving worse than any drunk person, and I knew that, so I stopped. I ended up pulling into a parking lot of this diner that was open 24 hours, which was only a few blocks from my house. With us sitting in the parking lot, both my niece and nephew settled down quite a bit and let me sit in silence while I tried to compose myself and figure out what to do. The clock in my car told me that my mom wouldn't be getting off work for the next 20 minutes, but I didn't have my cell phone to even call her. I shut off my car, telling the children that we would go into this diner and I would buy them ice cream. My nephew complained again that he didn't have any shoes, nor did I or even his sister, and my niece was still silent. They still followed me inside nonetheless, and all three of us in our pajamas. I was glad when the staff of the nearly deserted diner didn't stop us from coming in by the way we looked. We sat down in a booth and I told my niece and nephew I was going to go order ice cream. And I walked myself up to the front counter where the waitress and night manager were, and they looked at me with this puzzled look. Looking at them, I lied through my teeth, telling them that I was babysitting these kids and someone had broken into the house, and I told them that I was able to grab them and my purse before fleeing, and that I didn't bring my cell phone with me to call my mom. The manager was nice enough to let me use the phone behind the counter while the waitress walked over to the booth where my niece and nephew were, still sitting silently to watch them. The rest of the night staff in the kitchen quickly caught on to what was going on, and I could see them whispering amongst themselves while I dialed my mom's number. I managed to keep calm, almost a monotone voice, while talking to my mom. I told her that I had children at the diner and asked her to come as soon as possible. I refrained from telling her the same story that I told the manager and waitress. Instead, I told her that the children and I gotten scared and left the house in a panic. I didn't go back to the house that night. Instead, my mom came to the diner and to pick up the children and had called my sister-in-law to come home early from work that night. I ended up spending the night at my new boyfriend's house. I had finally told my boyfriend everything I had said here, and needless to say, he was skeptical. but wholeheartedly believed that something had scared me that night. He had also convinced me to move in with him, so I wouldn't have to sleep in my room with that dang scary face in my closet any longer. I called my mom and told her the next morning what I was planning to do, and she didn't fight much and instead sounded worried still for my niece. When she and my sister-in-law got back home that night, they found part of the chain link fence ran over from, I guess, when I backed out from the driveway so quickly, and I hadn't realized what I had done at the time, but the scrapes I found on the side of my car matched with what my mom was telling me. They had also found that the security door and the front door were both wide open. The toolbox I had grabbed from the backyard was tipped over in the hallway in front of my nephew's mangled door, and they also found a fillet knife in my nephew's room. I had broken down in tears when she told me that my nephew's blanket had been found dragged into the living room, stopped just before the threshold of the front door. I knew that face had most likely followed us, but the thought of it actually chasing us was way too much for me to even handle. Over the next week, my brother returned from his business trip and ended up receiving his promotion, so he would be able to move his whole family out of the house as well. My mom had eventually been convinced to sell the house, but not before my niece had another episode. She had gotten a hold of another knife in the middle of the night and had woken her parents up by stabbing her mother in the thigh while she was sleeping. I met my family at the hospital that next morning, and my sister-in-law was fine, and oddly enough, my niece and nephew were acting as normal, like nothing even happened. My brother was worried enough to call a realtor that day to try to find somewhere to live beside my mom's cursed house. That day, my mom finally opened up to me about the nightmares my niece was having. Finally, some closure. The person who would go into her room at night apparently resembled myself, wrapped up in a bundle of blankets with just my face exposed. She would call herself a witch and tell my niece that her family was going to die and that she had to save them. My brother and sister-in-law also knew about this, and they even heard my voice when I wasn't home or when I was sleeping in my room. No one even told me about this because I never said anything myself. My mom even went as far as telling me that she didn't want to scare me when I was home alone watching the children at night. I never told them about the face in my closet or about what I had seen that night. I haven't mentioned it to anyone else since. I had buried everything that happened deep in my mind, and thankfully nothing even slightly paranormal has happened since I moved out. Still, over 6 years later, I cannot shake the feeling that someone's watching me from my closet while I sleep. Credit of the story goes to Katie. Hit that thumbs up. Peace, I love you, and as always, God bless.